Well, welcome to Christ in Culture. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to continue in our series. We're looking at Wheaton College. I think I did my first video a few weeks back about Wheaton College, my old alma mater. I earned a graduate degree, not a graduate degree, but an undergraduate degree at Wheaton College, and I enjoyed attending Wheaton. I think it was a great education that I received from a Christian biblical worldview. But I am concerned lately after I've been reading in the Wheaton alumni magazine that comes to my house every other month or so, 2 or 3 months, every other 2 or 3 months. I get an alumni magazine from Wheaton College, and I've been disturbed lately as to what I see happening at Wheaton College. There is an attitude of this social justice warrior mentality that's taking over, sort of a political correctness that's been taking over at Wheaton College. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago that there was a recent alumni magazine that dealt with the whole issue of diversity on campus. There's a whole diversity push. They've hired an Office of Multicultural Engagement at Wheaton College. There is an effort to try to bring a quota system to hiring and students, some kind of a system where you can increase the number of persons with color, quote, persons of color, on faculty and represented among the students. So there's a definite affirmative action push to try to get more, quote, people of color on the faculty and, quote, people of color among students and administrators. And so there's this whole social justice warrior mentality that is creeping into Wheaton College, which, if we look at it from a biblical perspective, if we want to hold on to the biblical orthodoxy, the Christian biblical foundation for all of our thinking and believing and behaving in this world, we have to stop and ask ourselves the question, is this leftist, so-called progressivist, liberal social justice warrior emphasis a biblical agenda? Is this what Christian colleges and universities and institutions and churches should be getting into because of our direction from God to do so from the pages of Scripture? And if you ask that question, you will find that there is no mandate, there is no agenda coming from the Scriptures to do things like talk in terms of patriarchy, and to talk in terms of white privilege, and to talk in terms of misogyny, and talk in terms of underrepresentation of women in fields and so forth. And you will find that all of those terms and a whole host of other terms that go along with this social justice movement are found not in the Bible, but they're found in the writings of Karl Marx and the sociologists and the social scientists of today. And we are getting and we're seeing an agenda that is coming in from outside of the Christian world, outside of the biblical worldview, and being imposed on Christian institutions like Wheaton College, like church denominations, like parachurch organizations. This social justice warrior mentality is coming in from outside. It's a foreign philosophy. It has nothing to do with biblical righteousness, nothing to do with biblical justice. It is a foreign, secular ideology being imposed on the Christian church. And we see this happening, unfortunately, at institutions like Wheaton College. I also mentioned that it's happening at seminaries like my old alma mater, Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. It's a creeping poison that's coming into Christianity that has nothing to do with the biblical view of justice and righteousness and social order. It has everything to do with the secular Marxist critical race theory, sociology, social politics, and political correctness that we see in the far leftist ideology of our times. And so this is now coming into Christianity, and we have to expose it for what it is. It's not biblical. It's not Christian. It's something foreign to the Christian agenda. Well, today what I want to do is talk about another aspect of Wheaton College's drift into this social justice camp. And last time I talked about the racial and, quote, people of color angle on this social justice warrior mentality at Wheaton College. And I talked about in terms of how they're talking about actually bringing up race and bringing up racial quotas in hiring faculty and bringing students on board in an effort to bring some kind of racial parity into the campus of Wheaton College, which again is not a biblical agenda. Well, now I want to talk about another aspect of this whole social justice agenda, and that is gender parity. Yes, Wheaton College is now having goals about gender parity. Now, what is gender parity? It simply means that there should be an equal number of women to men and an equal number of men to women, and that there should be some kind of balance in positions of hiring at Wheaton College, among students and among administrators. There should be this gender parity. And where did we get this? Where did this come into? Is this something that is found in the Bible? Are we given this agenda from God through his revelation? Or is this something, again, that's coming in from the outside? It's a secular, foreign ideology, political and economic agenda coming in, imposed by our secular culture upon the church, and the church is asking how to respond to it. And in many instances, the response is, well, we just simply follow the lead of our culture because this is the culture that we live in. We want to be a part of it. And so we need to just go along with the flow of our culture and just accept what is being given to us as far as an agenda from our culture. And that's what Wheaton College seems to be doing. Here is an article. I'll show you the article in the Wheaton Alumni magazine. And this is back from a few years back, but it does serve as an example of what's taking place at Wheaton College right now. It's dealing with a professor. Her name is Amy Reynolds, and here's a picture of Professor Amy Reynolds. And she is part of the Wheaton faculty, and she is doing research in the field of gender parity. And it says here, the headline says, Professors research to explore best practices for gender parity. So I guess the assumption is that gender parity is a good thing, and that should be desired at a Christian college or in the Christian world or a Christian church or anything Christian. There should be gender parity. That's the assumption that the headline gives. But again, where do we get that assumption? Is that something the Bible gives us? Does the Bible teach that we should be very careful in the church and we should be very careful in our clubs and organizations and groupings in society that there be gender parity, that there be an equal number of women to equal number of men? I don't see that in the Bible. I don't see that as an authentic Christian agenda item. I know that a lot of churches today seem to feel that that is some kind of a Christian agenda, but I question where they get that idea. I think they're getting that from the secular world. I think they're borrowing from the secular world, and they're trying to baptize it as a Christian idea. For example, the big megachurch Willow Creek, highly influential church Willow Creek, it has a elders board, and they allow women on the elders board, which is, again, an unbiblical concept. The Bible speaks very specifically that God in his providence and in his will wants men to lead and teach in the primary meetings of the church. Well, Willow Creek dispenses with that, and they take a more progressive, leftist, radical, secular view and say, no, we're going to have gender parity. And so their elder board, they have women on their elder board. Well, not only do they have women on the elder board, they also have an equal number of men and women, or approximately an equal number of men and women in elders, serving as elders in the church. Again, because of gender parity. That's the goal. That's the ideal, evidently, that Willow Creek is shooting for. Now, again, where do you get that agenda item? Why is that a goal? Why should that be a goal in the Christian community? We are not taught that in the Bible. We're not taught that there needs to be an equal number of women in leadership in the church or in Christian institutions. That's just something that I think today is assumed, but if we go back and we actually look into it and research it, we find that this is not an authentically Christian agenda. God creates men and women. They're of equal value and worth before God, but he doesn't ever say anywhere that they have equal functions in society as far as their public visibility or their leadership or their functions in all kinds of ways. There's nothing in the Bible that says that we need to have as a goal gender parity in all uniform right across society. So again, you're getting a lot of borrowing from the culture. You're getting a lot of secular assumptions being brought in. And here again, at Wheaton, we're seeing these secular assumptions being played out. It says that in the article, the headline is Professors Research to Best Explore Practices for Gender Parity. It says that women are not well represented in the leadership of evangelical organizations, and that's not a surprise, according to Dr. Amy Reynolds, Assistant Professor of Sociology. So she has done research, and she found that women are not very well represented in evangelical organizations. And she's a sociology professor. Well, let's back up and talk about sociology. Sociology is one of the most secular, leftist, liberal, so-called progressive areas of study in a university. Sociologists are known to be some of the most radical leftist professors at state universities and colleges. And here again, we have a Wheaton College professor who is a sociologist. Now, I'm not saying that she is exactly like the secular sociologists. I'm not saying that she is even a radical leftist, but I'm saying that perhaps, just perhaps, her field of study, which is steeped in leftism and socialism and Marxist critical theory and critical race theory, perhaps her assumption that gender parity is a goal for Christianity is influenced, maybe just a little, by the overwhelmingly secular field in which she is studying, sociology. So she is researching evangelical organizations, and she's alarmed that women are not equally represented or very well represented in these fields. And that seems to be a problem for her because she's assuming that women should be at a gender parity with men in all fields, evidently, or else that wouldn't be such a disturbing finding that women are not well represented in all fields. Because only under the assumption that they should be is this a problem. We go on. After evaluating close to 1,500 evangelical organizations through a research project funded by the Imago Dei Foundation, she and Dr. Janelle Curry, provost at Wheaton College, which is another evangelical Christian college, found that women held 16% of the very top leadership positions, 21% of the board positions, 23% of the total leadership positions in the organizations they studied. Comparatively, at nonprofits in general, these are nonprofits that are not necessarily Christian, they're just all nonprofits lumped together. Nonprofits in general, women held 45% of the very top leadership positions and make up 43% of the board. Reynolds says she and Curry plan to present their findings in full at the Religious Newswriters Association conference. So she and her colleague have been studying Christian organizations, and you know what? They found that women are not well represented in Christian leadership positions in Christian organizations. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem only if you assume that, along with the secular organizations, that there should be gender parity in all levels of leadership in the Christian church and Christianity. But where does that assumption come from? Again, it doesn't come from the Bible. It doesn't come from a Christian worldview. It doesn't come from the Old Testament. It doesn't come from the New Testament. It doesn't come from the great thinkers and theologians throughout Christian history over the last 2,000 years. It comes from the secular field of study of sociology, which includes Marxism and critical race theory and leftist and liberal assumptions about the way society should be. And what is the danger here is that those assumptions are uncritically brought in to the Christian church and imposed on the Christian church and Christian organizations as if there's something that we should be all up in arms about, that the fact that women are not widely represented in the Christian organizations, this is terrible. Well, maybe it's not terrible. Maybe it's something that is not anything to be alarmed about, because maybe God makes men and women different, and maybe they have different callings in life, and maybe most women have children and a family to manage, and maybe most women don't have the time or the inclination or the training or the skills even to go into these higher levels of organizational leadership and still maintain their primary calling, which is to be wife and mother of children and keeper of families and managers at home. Maybe the thing that we're making a mistake in the secular world, in the modern world, is that we are confusing the role of men and women in society. We're trying to treat them as interchangeable. And we saw this in the 70s with the feminist movement, the modernist feminist movement, the Gloria Steinem, and all of the women who were calling for down with the patriarchy, down with the male-dominated society, and so on and so forth, this rebellion against the idea that God created men as men and women as women, and there are certain roles and functions and callings that a man has and a certain role and function that women have, and that God created them that way. The feminist movement wanted to destroy that, and they wanted to destroy that in the name of equality. They wanted to say, well, we're not locked into any kind of calling or giftedness or position by any higher power, especially by a God. We're not locked into any of those things. We want to be able to do whatever we want to, and we should be able to do anything a man can do. And some feminists actually had a slogan, we can do anything a man can do, only better. So in other words, there was this one-upmanship. We're going to show you that we can do anything. And that's where we've gotten to today, where we have women demanding the right to go into, for example, and be a part of the Navy SEALs or Special Forces or whatever. And the military is caving into these feminist demands and actually reducing the standards of soldiers who are qualified for the Navy SEALs and Special Forces. Why? Because they want women to be able to enter into these areas, which is insane. Because you want the highest standards. You don't want, the Navy SEALs and the Special Forces, they're so high of standards that most men in the military can't even qualify. And now they want to let down the standards to enable women to come into these areas just for some ideological, political victory on the part of feminism. Well, you can see the absurdity of that. Well, now we're dealing with this confusion in academia, in Christian education, where there's this false assumption that there needs to be gender parity among faculty and leadership in the Christian academic world. Well, that is a false assumption that needs to be exposed, and I hope that it will be exposed in the years to come so that we don't have to operate under some imposition, a false assumption in our educational system. The article goes on. The second part of their research involves an in-depth review of 400 evangelical organizations, and the final piece will include formal interviews with leaders of organizations where women are represented well on both the board and executive team by analyzing the policies, strategies, plans, and the role of theology in the organizations that have successfully increased women's representation in leadership. Doctors Reynolds and Curry hope to provide tools to determine how organizations are faring and are developing a set of best practices for Christian organizations to help them implement and represent women and have men and women thriving in leadership roles. Okay, so what they're going to be doing, the assumption is there needs to be gender parity in all Christian organizations at all levels. Like I said before, that's a false assumption. It is not biblical. It is not Christian. It does not take into account the gifts and callings of God, the difference between men and women and their callings by God. It does not take into consideration any of that. Now they're going to also study the Christian organizations that have, quote, successfully represented women in their organizations. And I guess they would assume that something like a Willow Creek would be a, quote, successful organization at implementing these changes. And they would look to Willow Creek and say, see, Willow Creek has an equal number of women on the elders board and the equal number of men. Willow Creek had recently hired a woman senior pastor. And so they would give Willow Creek an A+ for implementing this leftist agenda of gender parity. And they would look at theology as maybe a reason why. Well, yes, you would look at theology and say, well, you know what? Women who are ordained to ministry in churches, those churches have a better record of gender parity than those churches that don't ordain women to ministry. Well, you know what? Theology does play an important role in a Christian worldview. And those churches who do not ordain women to ministry, who are faithful to the biblical teaching, to the Pauline teaching, the Apostle Paul teaches that women should not teach or have authority over men. When he writes those things and churches follow those and Christian organizations follow those, yes, they will be excluding women from certain levels of leadership, and this would then be something negative, I guess, in these two researchers' report. But again, we need to question the assumptions of this report. We need to dig down deeper below the surface and say, wait a minute, what gives you the right to impose on the Christian church and impose on Christian organizations a standard that is derived from the secular world, that is derived from critical theories and sociological models that are actually incompatible with the Christian biblical worldview, and then grade Christian organizations on these secular standards? It's a secular legalism. It's a secular imposition. There are rules that Christian organizations and colleges and institutions are now being asked to play by that are not biblical. I think there needs to be a whole lot more discussion, a whole lot more theology, a whole lot more thinking and reflecting on the hidden assumptions of the social justice movement. And this is one aspect of the social justice movement. It appears that Wheaton College has bought into a lot of the assumptions of the social justice movement, and as a result, it will hurt the college, I'm afraid to say. Now, the last paragraph, Dr. Reynolds says, our ultimate goal is to see women and men more effectively working alongside one another, both among their gifts, using their gifts and talents as they work together for the sake of God's kingdom. Well, yes, that's a good goal, and it doesn't necessarily mean working alongside each other doesn't necessarily mean, for example, at a local church, that you have to have women teaching in the main church service on Sunday mornings, and you have to have men and women teaching to have gender parity, and that's the ideal goal. No, that doesn't necessarily follow from Christian assumptions, but it does follow from secular assumptions. And so what I want to challenge Wheaton College and all Christian institutions and organizations is let's make sure we're following our agenda that God gives us and not simply following the agenda of the world. We don't want to be shaped and formed by the world. There's a passage, and I love it because J.B. Phillips translated it a little bit loosely, but he says, don't let the world shape you into its mold. And that's exactly what I would say to Wheaton College. Don't let the secular social justice movement shape you to the point where you are now talking in terms of racial quotas for hiring students, faculty, and administrations and admissions, and don't let the secular world shape you into its mold as far along as gender ideology and identity, politics, and so on and so forth. Stand strong as a Christian institution. Use Christian assumptions, Christian teachings, and do not follow the crowd of the secular world. Well, I hope that's been helpful. We'll see you back here next week on another edition of Christ and Culture. God bless.